So I've finally got the Agincourt. This ship, of course, came out quite a long time ago, but only in loot boxes. You couldn't get it any other way other than gambling. So, of course, I didn't get it back then. However, it's available for doubloons now. It's a tier 5 British battleship, and it's got 14 guns. But surprisingly, the guns are really not the selling point of the Agincourt. The secondaries definitely are. And to really understand what makes this ship so special, we need to look at the secondary DPM that this ship has. And yes, it actually has more secondary DPM than the Schlieffen, with similar dispersion values. Of course, if we go over to hitting DPM, which tries to take into account its dispersion on the secondaries, you can see it's just behind the Schlieffen, a tier 10 known for having the best secondaries in the entire game. This, of course, is insane and doesn't tell you the full picture. It really comes down to the pen, right? You don't pen 32 millimeters with this ship on all these secondaries. In fact, the 75 millimeter ones, I believe, are basically useless. They only pen the odd destroyer, really, and a few cruisers, I suppose, at this tier. But really, the 150s are where you're getting most of your damage from, since they can pen 25, which is enough at this tier to pen most ships. But it really comes down to the amount of secondaries you're hitting, and of course the fires. This ship gets so many fires from its secondaries because it has so many secondary shells that have really good fire chance. And given that the AP is just kind of okay on the main guns, you find you're just spamming HE a lot and getting a ton of fire damage. The secondaries are a ton of fun to use, and at this tier are kind of just overpowered. So if you're playing a tier 5 and you're in a match like this one where we get to play against some tier 4s, yeah, it's going to be a pretty good time. You're not going to get that all the time, though. So against tier 7s, you will struggle, right? You're not going to get into that 8.3 kilometer secondary range all the time. But for these matches, having this kind of secondary power is amazing. Unfortunately, though, you can't really get the secondaries off on people without showing pretty much flat broadside. The chart here that shows the angles of all these secondaries really paints a pretty horrible picture. So it's nowhere near as flexible as the Schlieffen is. It's nowhere near as good as the Schlieffen is, but it's at tier 5 and not a tier 10. And that's the crazy thing about this ship. So as kind of a low tier seal clubbing ship, it's pretty hilarious given the firepower that this thing has from its secondaries. It's also just decent as far as a tier 5 battleship goes too. It's got a lot of firepower given that there's 14 guns, poor dispersion. It's not very quick, but it has decent enough armor, and you can last through most games in it, given that there's really not a ton of superstructure to hit here. There's like no AA though, so you're struggling against carriers, but let's be honest, at tier 5, you're going to struggle against carriers in any one of these battleships. So you're not really missing out too much as we get... Is that 3 fires burning on the Cavar there? That is... it's going to be a lot of damage. Now, I don't know if I recommend you buy this ship outright. It's very situational and relies on these lower tier games to really shine. But if you're a really passionate secondary battleship player, I think it's a good enough time to warrant picking up, especially since tier 5 ships generally aren't the most expensive as far as doubloons go. And since it's premium, you of course have the ability to swap any commander onto it, so you're pretty likely to have a 19-point commander at least that you can swap onto this thing and get full advantage of these secondaries. It's pretty fun, but you are very reliant on the matchmaker. So getting against these tier 5 games, you can have some pretty monster games like 104,000 damage and 3 kills. It is definitely a seal clubber's ship, that is for sure, assuming you get the right matchmaker. So a decent game overall, I would say, especially with those 14 defended, giving us actually pretty decent base XP for tier 5. I think the issue comes, though, when you're playing this ship, you have the worst matchmaker possible, because you can only at most face tier 4s, since there's protected matchmaker down lower, but you can face up to tier 7. So you have this weird situation where it's +2, -1 matchmaker. So on average, you're facing higher tier opponents. And maybe that's why some of these tier 5 premiums seem very strong, because we're giving those that you're going to be facing on average tier 6s and above most of the time. So they make them a little stronger to make it feel a little bit easier. Here we're getting into a duel with another Agincourt. Of course, playing this ship right as it was available. There's a lot of them in the matchmaker as people wanted to finally try out these ships. And, well, it's just kind of a see who lights more fires kind of scenario. Our secondaries really aren't going to be penning too many times on each other just because we don't have superstructures. So it really comes down to the amount of fires. And you get a lot of fires on this thing. Of course, at low tier, HE does Citadel cruisers as well. So it's not bad, the HE and the main guns, but really it is the secondaries you're playing this ship for. And it is a lot of fun, I got to admit. It's a very fun ship to play. And not all the time are you going to get these kind of games where you get everybody pushing in. You can see we've got our friendly, I believe that's a tier 6, or maybe that's the tier 5 on the German battle cruiser line. He's already pushed into the middle of B-Cap and is on the enemy side of the map. Sometimes you get these games where everybody just wants to push in, and it's a ton of fun at low tier especially, but a lot of times you're going to run into the kiting, running away kind of playstyle that we've all gotten used to, just because it's a little bit more optimal. Facing off against destroyers, of course, it's really kind of nasty what this ship can do. And this is where even the small caliber 75mm guns, I believe, can even pen. Hilariously, you can see the shell velocity on those little guns is so low that they're getting shot way up into the air, much like Atlanta salvos, except we're only at 6 kilometers here. So it's unlikely they're going to hit unless something is really at close range, since a little bit of maneuvering is enough to dodge them. But it is the 150s that are going to be doing the main damage here. And they have decent alpha at, I believe, 2200, which isn't bad for some secondary shells that have pretty decent accuracy and fire chance. I think at low tier, the reason these secondary battleships work so well is that most of these fights do happen at such close range compared to a lot of the tier 10 games. I think people are more interested in pushing in, and maybe that's just down to people being newer to the game, but you see a lot of people with a lot of battles at these lower tiers anyway, so I don't think it's necessarily just the beating up on noobs is why that these games happen to be at closer ranges. I think people just want to play these ships at closer range since they don't like the tier 10 meta perhaps, and that's why a lot more people are playing down here. So you can get very good use of these secondaries. I noticed this when playing the Oklahoma. This is the obvious comparison to make. Agincourt or Oklahoma? Well, Oklahoma has 127mm secondaries, so they're doing less alpha and less fire chance than the 150s here, but you don't have to deal with the 75mm that really don't have the pen. I think the Agincourt overall is just a much better secondary battleship than the Oklahoma, but the Oklahoma was a ship you could get entirely for free in a dockyard event, I believe, or maybe it was one of those smaller campaigns, that kind of thing, that came with combat missions. But this ship is definitely better than the Oklahoma, if you were wondering. And secondaries, of course, at low tier are very useful for when you get snuck up on by a destroyer or you're having to face multiple targets on multiple sides of your ship. They do a great job. And we get our 4th kill in this one. Not quite cracking, but I'm sure that's just on the horizon because this ship is incredibly strong inside 8.3 kilometers, since that's your secondary range. Nearly 100 hits in this one, and another Confederate. Racking up Confederates is pretty easy considering you can switch targets so easily and quickly on your secondaries and on your main guns. Agincourt's top 1 and 2 on our team. That's pretty solid. 15k out of our secondaries. Pretty solid result, and a little bit of fire damage as well. Now, I don't mean to sell this ship too hard, as it is very situational, especially in those up tiers. I showed you the best scenarios for a ship like this, and I think it's fun in those scenarios. So if these low tier secondary battleships are interesting to you, Agincourt is definitely the best of the bunch. Here you can see the commander that I'm using. I think it's pretty standard secondary battleship build for lower tiers, especially when fires are going to be the main concern, right? I'm not running the extra heals. We're going for fires since we don't really have superstructure to worry about. That's why you would want to run heals, by the way, is if you have a pretty easy superstructure to farm. Here we don't, so we want to reduce the fire damage as much as possible. Of course, on the equipment, we're trying to maximize our secondaries, and at tier 5, there's nothing really too interesting here. That is the Agincourt, and a ship that I had a lot of fun with playing, and I hope that in the future we don't see more of these ships resulting in loot boxes. I'm glad Wargaming had fixed their mistake and released this ship properly. So, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.